Welcome to New Testament Greek Exegesis 1, Lesson 7, Verbal Aspect. This is going to be just a basic introduction to verbal aspect and some of the concepts and debates involved. Just to get us started, verbal aspect is basically the author's viewpoint of the action of the verb, not necessarily the actual action of the verb. It is primarily subjective. It is encoded into the verb tense form. And there are two aspects we're going to talk about, imperfective and perfective. And time then is a function of the context and not of the verb stem itself. So that's a brief introduction. Some of the terminology we need to be aware of. Time is the time when the action of the verb occurs. Tense form is the morphological form of the verb. It's not time. Action zart is the kind of action expressed by the verb. Aspect is the author's view of the action. Perfective is the view of the action externally as a whole. Imperfective is the view of the action internally as a process. Remoteness is the action is viewed as remote. Proximity is the action is viewed as proximate to the reader or to the author. Stativity is the verb expresses a state of affairs. Semantics is the meaning of the tense form. Pragmatics is the use in the implicatures of the tense form. Now there's three major schools that we're going to look at. The first is Porter. Porter sees he sees three aspects: perfective aspect, imperfective aspect, and stative aspect. And he also postulates a non-aspectual verb form, which is the future. And then he also has non-remoteness and remoteness. So the aorist tense form encodes perfective aspect and non-remoteness. Imperfective aspect is encoded in the present tense for non-remoteness, and the imperfect tense form for remoteness. Stative aspect is encoded in the perfect for non-remoteness and in the pluperfect for remoteness. And then the future tense form encodes future time plus expectation. Fanning, however, sees only two aspects, perfective aspect and imperfective aspect, and he also has a non-aspectual category in which the future takes place. And he also sees tense playing a part in these forms as well, future, present, and past. So for perfective aspect, the perfect tense form encodes perfective aspect and present tense or present time plus a state of action zart. And the aorist and pluperfect encode perfective aspect and past time reference. Whereas imperfective aspect is encoded in the present tense with present time reference, and imperfective aspect is encoded in the imperfect and past time reference, and then the future is non-aspectual. Campbell, and this is the system that I'm going to be adopting for this class, he sees two aspects, perfective aspect and imperfective aspect. And he also sees proximity and remoteness, but he also sees heightened proximity and heightened remoteness. And then there's a non-spatial category of the future, which encodes future time. Now, perfective aspect is found in the aorist, and it also encodes remoteness. Perfective aspect is also found in the future tense form, but it is non-spatial, therefore it encodes future time reference. Imperfective aspect is found in the perfect tense, which also encodes heightened proximity, the present tense, which encodes proximity, the imperfect tense form, which also encodes remoteness, and the pluperfect, which also encodes heightened remoteness. Now, some of the basics of verbal aspect is aspect describes the viewpoint of the speaker or author, not necessarily how the action actually took place in the real world, but how the author has chosen to portray that action to the reader. Perfective aspect is an external viewpoint, and it sees the action as a whole. Imperfective aspect is an internal viewpoint, and it sees the action without reference to beginning or end. An aspect then in biblical Greek is synthetic, and it's subjective. Aspect, tense, and actions art. These are three terms that need to be carefully understood and distinguished. Aspect is the viewpoint of the action. It's encoded in the morphological tense form. Tense denotes grammatical temporal reference. It is not uniquely determined by the tense form, and it is not enough to describe the action for the Greek verb. So the Greek verb encodes aspect. It does not encode tense or time reference. Actions art is the type of action, how it takes place in the real world, and basically there's going to be punctiliar, iterative, ingressive, stative, etc. And these are going to be determined by a combination of contextual factors. So these things, actions art is not encoded in the tense form. These are pragmatic uses of the various aspects in the context that they're found. It's also important to distinguish the difference between semantics and pragmatics. When these are confused, then the waters get muddied and there can be some confusion. Semantics is the values are encoded in the verbal form itself. And semantic values are uncancelable. That means they were always present. So when the present tense form is used, there are certain semantic meanings that are always there. Whereas there are some cancelable meanings that are determined by the context, which may or may not be there when the present tense is used. But so we want to talk about the semantic value, or those values which are always present in a tense form. And so therefore aspect is a semantic value. When a tense form is used, it always has the same semantic value. It always has the same verbal aspect. Pragmatics, though, are semantic values in the context which determine the function of the verb. Pragmatic values are cancelable, therefore they may not always be present. In some context, the present tense may be used in one way, but in a different tense, that present tense may be used in a different way, not always having the same pragmatic use. In the pragmatic use are usually combined the lexeme, the aspect, and the context. And so actions art is a pragmatic value. Semantics asks, who am I? Pragmatics asks, what do I do? So it's really important to understand that when the present tense form is used or the aorist tense form is used, there is a semantic meaning that will always be there. But there's also a pragmatic meaning that may be there under certain circumstances, but a different pragmatic meaning for that same tense form may be present under different contextual situations. So semantics is always there, who am I? It's encoded in the tense form, whereas pragmatics asks, what do I do? It's how that tense form is being used in different contexts. So keep those two straight. Now, there are some current issues that are still being debated in verbal aspect. There are a lot of areas of agreement. Aspect is a key to understanding biblical Greek. Most modern scholars will agree with that. There are a few that don't. There are at least two aspects, perfective and imperfective. Almost everyone agrees that these two aspects do exist in the Greek verbal system. Most agree that debate ought to be resolved quickly, though it's been going on for 20 years or more. So the debate is still hotly contested. They also agree that Greek grammars and New Testament reference tools should be updated to reflect this debate in aspect. So one of the problems with using older commentaries, older reference tools, is they are still using either Aktionsart or Zeitart or even pre-linguistic terminology, which is not accurate and can cause confusion. So Greek grammars and reference tools need to be updated to reflect these modern discoveries. And then its responsible exegesis must incorporate aspect into it. So any responsible exegete needs to take verbal aspect into consideration. So those are areas of agreement. The two biggest areas that are unresolved are, do Greek verbs encode tense, or do they encode time reference? And so that's still a debate. Campbell, whom we're going to follow, says no. Porter definitely says no. Though Fanning is a little unsure. It's uncertain exactly where he stands on that. And a lot of other people who talk about verbal aspect also talk about time being coded in the verb tense form, though Campbell does not, Porter does not. Now, the number of aspects is up to debate. Campbell says 2, Fanning says 2, but Porter says 3. And there's other people that say 4. And so there's still debate about the number of aspects. And so one of the biggest debates is stative an aspect, or is that a pragmatic Aktionsart? Is that a pragmatic outworking of aspect and context? Campbell says stativity is a pragmatic outworking. Porter will say stativity is a aspect. So that's still under debate as well. So perfective aspect is primarily encoded in the aorist tense form. It portrays action from a summary viewpoint, from an external viewpoint. It's not necessarily punctiliar. For example, in Romans 5:6, it says death reigned from Adam to Moses, and that's an aorist. Well, I mean, it was not a one-time event. Death reigned for hundreds or thousands of years. Aorist is used. So it's a summary viewpoint, not a punctiliar viewpoint. It's not a point in time, but merely looking at the event as a summary. Taking in the whole event, the beginning, the end, it's all seen as one. Now, summary can cover an activity over a long period of time. Past tense is not a semantic value, but remoteness is, and we'll talk more about that later. Semantic values are perfective aspect and remoteness, and they are combined in context to refer to past events primarily. That's why it's used primarily in mainline narratives. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Also, perfective aspect is encoded in the future tense form. Though the future tense form is still highly debated, whether it's imperfective or perfective, whether it's non-aspectual or aspectual, whether it refers to future time or not. So that is still highly debated. But Campbell says it encodes perfective aspect. It always refers to future, therefore it has future tense, according to Campbell. And semantic values are perfective aspect and future temporal reference. Now, imperfective aspect is primarily found in the present tense form. Universally regarded as imperfective in aspect, almost every scholar agrees that the present tense form grammaticalizes imperfective aspect. It has the spatial value of proximity, and it's usually found in discourse. Imperfect tense form also incorporates or grammaticalizes imperfective aspect, but is also spatially remote. And it usually supplies supplemental offline information in narrative. So not the mainline information, but background information. Now, imperfective aspect is also found in the perfect tense form. Now, this is highly debated, but we're going to consider that the perfect tense form has imperfective aspect in this course. It has a spatial value of heightened proximity, or is often used as a superpresent. Its semantic values are imperfective aspect with heightened proximity, and it is used primarily in discourse, not in the narrative. The pluperfect tense form also grammaticalizes imperfective aspect, but it is doubly remote. It has heightened remoteness, and it also provides supplemental information, often background information to the background information. So its semantic values are imperfective aspect and heightened remoteness. So here's a good chart from Dr. Campbell, where you can see up on the top here, the aorist tense is viewing the action as a whole. It is viewing the beginning to the end. It's seeing all of the action in one view, and it also is remote from that action. On the bottom, you have imperfective aspect, which is viewing the action as ongoing. It's viewing it internally, not looking at the beginning and the end, but as the action is happening. And you can see that the perfect tense has heightened proximity. It is closest to the action. Then the present tense has proximity. The imperfect tense form has remoteness, and it's looking at the action often from a further perspective, often viewing it in the past tense. And then you have pluperfect, which is heightened remoteness, which is looking at the action from a heightened remote perspective, and it often gives background information and even background information to the background. So the aorist tense form is being used for the narrative, taking a look at the action. Jesus went to Capernaum. Jesus entered the temple. Jesus broke the bread. It's just giving the events as they happen. Whereas the imperfect tense form will say, as Jesus was speaking, he broke the bread. Or as Jesus was praying, he broke the bread. So it'll give you that background information. It's almost as if the action is going on. Or as they were seeking to arrest Jesus, Jesus slipped away, aorist tense, into the crowd. So we're going to take a look at that in more detail. But that chart is kind of helpful to see how the different aspects and the spatial reference is being portrayed in a narrative. So here again is the tense form semantic values of Campbell. Perfective aspect, grammaticalized in the aorist in the future. Imperfective aspect, grammaticalized in the perfect, the present, imperfect, and pluperfect. Heightened proximity in the pluperfect, proximity in the present, remoteness in the aorist and the imperfect, heightened remoteness in the pluperfect, and then the future time reference in the future tense form. Now, one of the things that is going to be a little more challenging, but you're going to have to work out, is the relationship between semantics and pragmatics. Semantics is verbal aspect, perfective aspect, imperfective aspect, whereas pragmatics is going to be the actions art, how that action actually took place. And what we're going to see is the lexeme plus the aspect plus other contextual factors will equal the actions art. So a transitive lexeme is a lexeme that actually affects a direct object. So walk is not a transitive lexeme. Walk, I walked down the street. I'm not affecting the street in any way. I'm just walking. But I hit the ball. Hit now is a transitive lexeme because it is transferring its action to the direct object, which is the ball. So a transitive lexeme is action that is performed on an object. The object must be affected. And there are subcategories of punctiliar. If the action is instantaneous, there will be other types of actions depending on the aspect and the context. So transitive lexemes will transfer the action to a direct object. Intransitive lexemes do not take direct objects, or if it does, the object is not affected by the action. So no object or no action performed on an object. A subcategory might be stative if it's describing a state or being. That would be an actions art. Ambitransitive verbs are lexemes that can function both as a transitive verb and both as, or also as an intransitive verb, depending on the usage and the context. So here is a chart by Campbell. For example, the lexeme poieo, to do or to make, tithemi, to place or to put, balo, to throw. You can see that balo could be punctiliar. So I throw the ball. That could happen. That could be a one-time event. But it also could be iterative. So in other words, I threw many balls, or I threw the ball back and forth. So it happened more than once. So you can see these charts. We have a lexeme, we have the gloss, and there's going to be subcategories in Campbell's book on whether they're punctiliar or stative or things like that. Now, the present indicative has various pragmatics when it's used with various lexemes and has various contextual factors. For example, the semantics of the present tense form is imperfective aspect and proximity. Now, if we have a lexeme that is non-punctiliar and non-stative, such as walk, and it allows progression, then the actions art will be progression. So he was walking down the street. If it is a present tense verb and has imperfective aspect and proximity, and the lexeme is stative, such as sit, and it allows stativity or creates stativity, then it's a stative verb. He sat at the table. He was sitting at the table, present tense. He is sitting at the table. So it's stative. He's at the table. If you have a present tense verb, it has imperfective aspect and proximity, and it has a punctiliar or a non-stative lexeme, such as hit, and it allows for repeated action, then you'll get an iterative actions art. So hit, if that's in the present tense, will be he was hitting, or he is hitting the ball, or he is hitting the wall. He is punching the man. So it is something that is happening in many times over and over. So if you have a present tense lexeme, which is going to be, if you have a present tense stem form, which is imperfective aspect, and you have a punctiliar verb, you're going to get an iterative actions art. If this was a aorist tense, the verb hit, now you have a perfective aspect, you're going to get a punctiliar, he hit the ball, or he punched the wall one time, and it happened in an instant, it would be punctiliar. But because it's a present tense, it's imperfective, therefore it's going to be iterative. It happened many times. It's a punctiliar event happening more than once. Now, if you have a present tense form, which is imperfective and has proximity, and you have any lexeme that allows for a general statement about reality, you'll get a gnomic statement, such as the worker is worthy of his wages. That's true at all times. So it's a true statement that's true of all people at all times, and you'll get a gnomic statement. That's the gnomic actions art. And sometimes you'll get a present tense verb, which has imperfective action and proximity, and is being used as a verb of propulsion or a verb of speaking. And you'll have Jesus went into the temple. And so you have the word going or moving into the temple, but it's a past tense, so the context is obviously the past tense. It's a narrative. And so Jesus, went into Jerusalem. He spoke to the people, and then Jesus went into the temple, but it's a present tense. It's definitely a past referring context. Therefore, you get what we call a historical present. And so we have a past referring present tense. And those are usually used to mark transitions in the narrative, to introduce dialogue, or also sometimes they're used, you'll have many present tense, historical presents, to mark a whole section as prominent. And John does that a lot. Sometimes you'll find a section that has 7, 10, or more present tense verb forms being used as historical presents, and that will mark that section as highly more prominent, more important than, say, another narrative where there are few or no present tenses being used as historical present. So there's pragmatic implicatures, there's pragmatic uses of the present tense in past contexts that have different uses, though the semantics of the present indicative is always imperfective aspect and proximity, though it has various pragmatic actions art or uses. Now, the imperfect indicative has the semantics of imperfective aspect and remoteness. So if you have a non-punctiliar lexeme or a non-stative lexeme, such as walking, and it allows progression, you'll get a progressive action art. Jesus was walking down the road. Jesus was walking in the temple area. So it's something that is going on, and it's going to be more remote. It's actually going to be background information to the rest of the narrative. Now, if you have imperfective aspect in a stative verb, such as eimi, and it allows for stativity, it'll be a stative verb. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's a stative idea. It's using the imperfective aspect, and it's going to be a stative actions art. If you have a non-punctiliar or non-stative verb, and it allows for a new direction or allows for progression, you can get an ingressive imperfect tense form, such as Jesus began to teach. Jesus began to speak. So ingressive means he begins to do something. If you have an imperfect tense form, it has imperfective aspect and remoteness, and you have a punctiliar verb form such as hit, and it allows for requires repetition, you'll get iterative. So Jesus was hitting the ball. So Bobby was hitting the ball. Past tense, iterative, punctiliar, happening more than once, so you get an iterative kind of thing. So you have a punctiliar verb, and then you get iterative actions art. And then finally, if you have an imperfect tense form and you have a non-stative lexeme, and it's obviously unsuccessful attempt, you can get a conative imperfect, such as they were arresting Jesus. They tried to arrest Jesus, but they didn't. Or they were looking for something, but they didn't find it. So they tried it, but they failed. It's conative. They were trying to kill Jesus. So the imperfective tense form will often be used with a non-stative verb form, and it's obvious in the context that the action was not completed. Therefore, Jesus was not killed at that moment. He was not found. He was not arrested. It is conative actions art. Now, the aorist indicative always has perfective aspect and remoteness for its semantic value, but it has a variety of actions art pragmatic outworkings. So if you have a non-punctiliar or non-stative verb such as walk, and it allows a summary, Jesus walked to Jerusalem, or Jesus went to Jerusalem. Jesus entered the temple. Death reigned from Adam to Moses. If you have a punctiliar tense form such as hit, and it allows punctiliarity, then you get a punctiliar actions art. Johnny hit the ball. If you have a stative or other type of verb form, such as sit or reign, and you have an entrance into a state or sets a new direction, you can have an ingressive aorist. So Jesus began to reign in the book of Revelation. Behold, the kingdom of our God has come, and he has begun to reign. Ingressive, he has begun to reign. If you have an aorist tense form with any kind of lexeme, it's a general statement about reality, you can get a gnomic idea, such as workers were worthy of their wages in the past. Any kind of tense form in the aorist, but as present referring, you get a present aorist, and there are aorists that are present referring, but it's an aorist tense, and it'll actually be simply like a summary, but it's actually in the present tense context. And sometimes you'll get an aorist lexeme, and an aorist tense form with any lexeme, but it'll also be future referring, and an aorist tense form can actually refer to the future, such as in Jude, where it talks about Enoch said, or Enoch prophesied, and it says, behold, the Lord came, and he judged. Well, it's obviously referring to the future. The Lord will come, and the Lord will judge the evildoers, but it's an aorist tense form. So it's a future referring aorist tense form. So those are the pragmatic outworkings of the aorist indicative. The perfect indicative is, the future indicative is perfective aspect and future temporal reference. A non-punctiliar, non-stative, which allows for summary, will be a summary future. Jesus will walk down the road. Jesus will come again. So that's a future tense summary action. If you have a punctiliar lexeme, and it allows for punctiliar, the context allows it, then you can get a punctiliar future. Jesus will destroy the beast. Or you have a stative or other type of lexeme with a future tense form, which has perfective aspect. And its entrance into the state, it could be an ingressive perfect. Jesus will begin to reign in the future. So the actions are for the future closely parallel those found in the aorist. Now the perfect indicative has imperfective aspect and heightened proximity. And if you have a stative lexeme, which is about half of the uses of the perfect tense in the New Testament, have stative lexemes like oida or gnosko, which refer to a state. And so that imperfective aspect, along with the stative lexeme, within a context that allows stativity, will give you a state of actions art. So the state of actions art is a pragmatic use or outworking of imperfective aspect and a state of lexeme. Now, if you have a perfect indicative with a verb of propulsion or indirect discourse, introducing discourse, such as moving or speaking, in a past referring context, you'll get a historical perfect, much like a historical present. And if you have a non-punctiliar or non-stative lexeme, which allows for progression, you'll get a progressive perfect. So there's also an extra step then that's going to be required for translating. You need to determine how to convey the heightened proximity of the perfect tense form. Is it intensification or is it going to be prominence? So the basic rule of thumb is intensification when likely or possible. Otherwise, you're going to give it prominence. Now, intensification heightens or sharpens the meaning of a verbal lexeme, such as run, if it was in the perfect, might mean sprint, or yell might be intensified to scream. And so there are some perfect lexemes, there are some lexemes when they're in the perfect, actually intensify the meaning of the verb form. Otherwise, it's going to provide prominence in the context. And so oftentimes when there is a perfect tense form in the context, that draws attention to either that clause, that idea, that word, or what comes after it. So it's going to give some kind of prominence to that clause or that section in which the perfect tense form is found. Now, it might be hard to do that in a translation, but it's roughly synonymous to stress. Now, the pluperfect indicative has imperfective aspect and heightened remoteness. So with a stative verb, which it usually is, and in contexts that allow for or create stativity, it's going to be stative, such as gnosko, or oida is going to give you a state of action, zart, with heightened remoteness. Most other lexemes, in a past referring context, you're going to get a past perfect idea, such as had. So Jesus had already eaten. So the pluperfect is found almost exclusively in narrative proper, and its normal function is to provide offline material. The aorist typically provide the skeletal structure. The pluperfect then would provide supplementary information to the narrative. And it's going to parallel the usage of the imperfect indicative, but it's going to be even further remote than the imperfect indicative. Now, it's naturally suited to remote imperfective nature to offline material. So the fact that it's hyper remote really makes it useful for offline material. And sometimes you have to use the English past perfect, he had done something, in order to express those ideas. Now, in non-indicative verb forms, the present tense in the subjunctive mood, the only difference between the present tense and the aorist tense subjective mood is aspect. Imperfective aspect often is used to express stativity in the subjunctive mood. So the only difference between a present subjunctive and an aorist subjunctive is going to be the aorist is going to look at things from an external perspective, usually in summary fashion, whereas the present subjunctive is going to look at the action from internally looking at it as a process. The present imperative is inherently suited to commands that are general in intent. Now, it does not imply that the intended action is continuous. For example, in the aorist tense, I may shut the door. That means do it now. But if I say, be shutting the door, present tense, it would be something like every time you come into the room, make sure you shut the door. It would be something that is ongoing, something that is always to be done. Whereas the aorist is going to give you a very particular command to do something in a particular context. Whereas the present imperative is going to give you a general kind of command. Now, certain lexemes, such as historical presence, will often express specific commands as well. Now, in the participle, the present tense almost always expresses action which is contemporaneous with the main verb, the verb that it is modifying. So if you have a main verb that is a present tense verb in a present context, then the participle will probably express action in the present tense that is also going on. If the main verb is in a context that is past referring, then the participle will express action that is contemporaneous with that past referring verb. Infinitives, imperfective aspect is suitable for such as begin to or about to. It's also used for concurrent actions such as ento and because, diata. So actions that are concurrent, actions that are going on or are just about to happen. So in the non-indicative nudes, the present tense form will highlight its imperfective. Now, the aorist in non-indicative tense forms, the perfective aspect plays an important role. In the subjunctive, the aorist subjunctive is like an emphatic future negative, or also heos plus the subjunctive occur only in the aorist. And often there's a parallel between the aorist subjunctive and the future indicative. So there's very little different meaning between a future indicative and an aorist subjunctive. In the imperative, the main pragmatic function is to convey a specific command, but it does not imply that the intended action is instantaneous or punctiliar. In participles, the main function is to describe action that is antecedent to the main verb, but it may also express contemporaneous action. And while it may express attendant circumstances in certain constructions, it often, but rarely, can convey subsequent action. So if the aorist indicative or aorist participle occurs before the main verb, it usually expresses antecedent action about 70% of the time. If it comes after the main verb, oftentimes it'll express attendant circumstances or subsequent actions. And the aorist infinitive is used mainly in temporal constructions, and usually an aorist plus an infinitive will be antecedent action, often with metata plus the infinitive, but also subsequent with pra to or pren plus the infinitive. Now, a couple of other things you need to think about as far as participles is, first of all, periphrastic constructions. All constructions but one convey the same aspectual and spatial semantic values as their finite equivalents. So an aorist indicative and an aorist periphrastic construction will have the same semantic value. Now, aspect is determined by the participle, not by the auxiliary verb, and the future periphrastic is imperfective, but the simple indicative verb is perfective. So one of the ways that a writer can express a imperfective future is to use the periphrastic construction. Often provides an imperfective aspect option then for the future tense. Now, adjectival participles are almost all present or perfect, reflecting their functions. And aorist may be used to express antecedent quality of a noun. So when you have an adjectival participle, it'll have a substantival or an adjectival use in the sentence. Almost all the presents then are going to be present or perfect, reflecting their functions, whereas aorist will almost always express antecedent action to the main verb in that participle. Now, substantival participles, the present reflects contemporaneous nature of the substantive. Aorist will reflect the antecedent nature of the substantive, and the perfect will be either contemporaneous or past with certain historical axioms. So there are some nuances that are going on with the participles depending on their tense form. Now, here's a great chart for periphrastic constructions. When you have a present indicative of a me plus a present participle, you'll get a present tense form. If you have an imperfect of a me plus a present tense form, you'll get an imperfect tense form. If you have a future of a me and a present tense form, you'll get a future indicative, a imperfective future rather than a perfective. If you have a present of a me in a perfect tense form, you'll get a perfect indicative. If you have imperfect of a me in a perfect tense form, you'll get a pluperfect indicative. Now, some participles have attendant circumstances, and they tend to take the force of a finite verb. Now, the tense force of the participle and the main verb are usually going to be aorist. The mood of the verb is usually imperative or indicative, and the participle then precedes the main verb. So sometimes it'll take on the force of a finite verb, and you almost have to translate that in English as an indicative or as an imperative. Perfective aspect of participles in a verb are often coordinate, so the aspectual significance overrides the temporal. So when you get a participle and indicative verb, the aspect of the participle is more significant than the temporal part of it. Now, the participle is contemporaneous with the verb, although even if it's aorist in that sense. Now, some of the exegetical significant things you need to be aware of is the participle itself may take on imperatival force. For example, in Matthew 28:19, go into all the world and make disciples, baptizing them and teaching them. It's not so much as you go, but it does take on the imperatival force of go. But it's important to realize that it's a participle. The only verb is make disciples, and you have three participles, go, baptize, and teach. Those are three ways that you make disciples. But those three participles do take on imperatival force. Go into the world, make disciples, baptize them, teach them. So it's always important to think through the implications of why is this a participle, and then how do I convey that into my English translation.